Hi guys, tonight we're going to explore one of humanity's oldest dreams. What if we suddenly stopped aging? Not just living longer, but completely halting the biological clock that's been ticking since our species first appeared. What would immortality actually mean for civilization, relationships, and what it means to be human? If you enjoy these thought-provoking sleep stories that explore the far-reaching consequences of our deepest desires, hit that like button and subscribe for more. And drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. It's wonderful to hear from listeners spanning the entire planet. Alright, let's begin. What if tomorrow morning, every human being on Earth woke up to discover that their bodies had simply stopped aging? Not just slowed down, not just extended lifespans, but completely halted the biological clock that has governed human existence since our species first walked upright across the African savanna 200,000 years ago. This isn't science fiction anymore. Today, researchers at Harvard Medical School have successfully reversed aging in mice using a combination of cellular reprogramming techniques, while scientists at the University of California, San Francisco have identified specific genetic pathways that control cellular senescence. The global anti-aging market, currently valued at $62 billion and projected to reach $421 billion by 2030, suggests humanity is already investing heavily in this possibility. But what would really happen if we achieved true biological immortality? Picture Sarah Martinez, a 35-year-old software engineer in Austin, Texas, checking her reflection one morning and realizing that the crow's feet around her eyes haven't deepened in months. Her 47-year-old neighbor, David Chen, notices his graying hair has stopped spreading. In Mumbai, 63-year-old Dr. Priya Sharma discovers her arthritis pain has vanished and her energy levels have returned to what they were decades ago. Across the globe, 7.8 billion human beings are experiencing the same impossible phenomenon. Their telomeres, the protective DNA sequences that typically shorten with each cellular division, have somehow stabilized. The accumulation of senescent cells that normally drives aging has halted. The gradual breakdown of collagen, the decline in mitochondrial function, the weakening of immune systems, all of it has simply stopped. The immediate medical implications would be staggering. The World Health Organization estimates that aging-related diseases account for 67% of all global deaths, approximately 38 million people annually. Heart disease, which claims over 17 million lives each year, often develops through decades of arterial damage and cellular degradation. Cancer rates, which increase exponentially with age due to accumulated DNA damage and declining immune surveillance, would fundamentally shift. Alzheimer's disease, affecting over 55 million people worldwide and consuming over $350 billion in care cost annually, might become a relic of the past if the brain stopped accumulating the protein plaques and tau tangles associated with neural aging. But the economic ramifications would dwarf even these medical miracles. Consider the pension systems of developed nations, carefully calibrated mathematical models built on actuarial tables that assume people will work for roughly 40 years and collect benefits for perhaps 20. The United States Social Security system, with its $2.9 trillion trust fund, operates on the assumption that workers will die at predictable rates. When the first American reached the age of 115 in 1896, she was a curiosity. Today, there are approximately 527,000 centenarians worldwide. If aging stopped, these numbers would become meaningless overnight. Japan, with the world's oldest population where 29% of citizens are over 65, would face an unprecedented crisis. The nation's demographic pyramid, already inverted with more elderly than young, would become a permanent fixture. Tokyo's population of 14 million includes 4 million people over 65 who consume approximately 43% of the national healthcare budget. Without death from aging, this ratio would freeze, creating a permanent dependency burden that would fundamentally alter economic structures that have evolved over centuries. The global workforce would transform beyond recognition. Currently, the average American changes careers 7 times and spends approximately 90,000 hours working over their lifetime. But what happens when a lifetime becomes indefinite? A software engineer who stops aging at 30 could potentially accumulate centuries of experience, becoming an unparalleled expert in their field. However, this same dynamic would create unprecedented barriers to entry for new workers. Why hire an inexperienced 22-year-old when you could employ someone with 300 years of accumulated expertise? Consider the city of Detroit, which has lost over 60% of its population since 1950, largely due to economic decline and demographic shifts. Urban planners and sociologists understand that cities naturally evolve as older generations pass away, and younger ones bring new ideas and energy. Without aging, Detroit's abandoned neighborhoods might remain frozen in time, their former residents neither dying nor necessarily adapting to change. The creative destruction that economist Joseph Schumpeter identified as essential to economic progress relies partly on generational turnover. Revolutionary ideas often come from young minds unencumbered by decades of established thinking patterns. The university system would face an existential crisis. Harvard University, founded in 1636, has educated over 375,000 alumni across nearly 4 centuries. But its current model assumes that professors will retire and students will graduate and move on with their lives. If a brilliant physicist stops aging at 28, they could potentially occupy a single professorship for millennia, accumulating knowledge and expertise at levels never before imagined. However, this same dynamic would prevent new voices and perspectives from entering academia. The peer review process, already sometimes criticized for favoring established researchers, could become completely ossified. Resource consumption patterns would shift dramatically. The average American consumes approximately 2,200 calories per day and produces about 4.5 tons of carbon dioxide annually. Currently, population models predict that global population will peak at around 10.9 billion by 2021 and then decline due to aging demographics. Without aging, population would continue growing indefinitely, limited only by birth rates and accidental deaths. Even with declining birth rates in developed nations, the absence of natural death would create exponential population growth over time. Housing markets would experience unprecedented pressure. Manhattan, with its 8,800 people per square mile, already faces severe housing shortages. The average apartment costs approximately $4,000 per month, partly due to limited supply. If people never aged and died, freeing up housing stock, prices would skyrocket beyond current levels. The suburban expansion that characterized American growth in the 20th century assumed that older generations would eventually downsize or pass away, allowing younger families to move into family homes. This natural circulation would cease entirely. Food production systems would strain under permanent population growth. Global agriculture currently produces enough food for approximately 10 billion people, though distribution inefficiencies create hunger for 820 million. Modern farming relies on crop rotation, soil regeneration, and seasonal cycles that have remained constant for millennia. Industrial agriculture in the American Midwest produces over 14 billion bushels of corn annually from 90 million acres. But this system depends on sustainable farming practices developed around predictable population models. Indefinite population growth would require revolutionary advances in agricultural efficiency or widespread adoption of alternative protein sources like cultured meat, and insect farming. The environmental implications extend far beyond food production. Climate change models predict that global temperatures will rise by 1.5 to 4 degrees Celsius by 2021, based partly on population projections that account for demographic transitions. The International Panel on Climate Change estimates that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees requires reducing global emissions by 45% by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. These targets assume current population trends, not indefinite growth from immortal humans. Consider the Amazon rainforest, often called the lungs of the earth, which covers 5.5 million square kilometers and houses approximately 10% of known species. Deforestation currently claims approximately 11,000 square kilometers annually, driven partly by agricultural expansion to feed growing populations. Without natural population control through aging, pressure on the Amazon and other critical ecosystems would increase exponentially. The forest's 400 billion trees sequester approximately 2.6 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually, a crucial service that would become even more valuable as human population grows indefinitely. Social structures built around family cycles would collapse and rebuild. The nuclear family model assumes that children will grow up, leave home, start their own families, and eventually care for aging parents. Marriage statistics show that 50% of marriages end in divorce, often after decades when couples have changed and grown apart. But what happens when couples don't grow old together, but potentially remain frozen at their current life stages forever? A 25-year-old woman who marries might face the prospect of being married to the same person for potentially thousands of years. Parent-child relationships would become increasingly complex. Currently, the average parent spends approximately 13 years actively raising each child from birth to independence. But if parents never age while children grow to adulthood, families could include hundreds of generations all appearing to be similar ages. A mother who stopped aging at 28 might eventually have great-great-grandchildren who appear older than she does. The wisdom and authority traditionally associated with age would lose all meaning when a person's apparent age bears no relationship to their actual experience. Educational systems would require complete reconstruction. The current model assumes that people learn intensively during childhood and young adulthood, then apply that knowledge throughout their working lives. But if working lives become indefinite, the relationship between learning and application would shift dramatically. Someone who learned computer programming in 1980 would have witnessed the entire digital revolution unfold. Their accumulated knowledge would be unprecedented, but their fundamental assumptions about technology might also become increasingly outdated without continuous adaptation. Legal systems built around concepts of natural lifespan would face fundamental challenges. Property inheritance, designed to transfer wealth from deceased parents to children, would become largely irrelevant. Estate planning, currently a $300 billion global industry, assumes that people will eventually die and need to distribute their assets. Life insurance, valued at over $5 trillion globally, exists specifically to provide financial protection after death. These entire economic sectors would need to be reimagined or might disappear entirely. Criminal justice systems would also require revolutionary changes. Currently, lengthy prison sentences derive their deterrent effect partly from consuming a significant portion of a criminal's natural lifespan. A 25-year sentence represents roughly 1/3 of an average adult's remaining life. But if someone could live for centuries or millennia, 25 years becomes a relatively minor inconvenience. The entire philosophy of punishment, rehabilitation, and deterrence would need fundamental reconsideration. Democratic institutions would face perhaps their greatest challenge. The concept of regular elections assumes that leadership will naturally change as politicians age out of office and new generations bring fresh perspectives. The United States Constitution requires presidents to be at least 35 years old, based on assumptions about maturity and experience that aging provided. But if a brilliant politician stops aging at 32, they could potentially hold office for centuries, accumulating power and influence at levels never before imagined in democratic societies. Consider the Supreme Court, where justices serve for life and currently average 25 years on the bench. Justice William Douglas served for 36 years, retiring at age 77. If justices never aged, they could potentially serve for centuries, making the court an even more powerful institution than it already is. The careful balance between different branches of government assumes natural turnover through aging and death. Religious institutions would grapple with theological implications that challenge fundamental doctrines. Most major religions promise some form of afterlife as consolation for earthly mortality. Christianity speaks of eternal life with God. Islam promises paradise for the faithful, and Buddhism seeks escape from the cycle of rebirth and death. If humans achieved biological immortality, the urgency and meaning of these spiritual promises would shift dramatically. Churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues would need to reframe their messages around permanent earthly existence rather than preparation for death and judgment. The Vatican, with its 2,000 years of theological development, would face questions that challenge core Christian doctrines. If Jesus died for human sins to provide eternal life, what meaning does that sacrifice hold if humans can achieve immortality through science? The Catholic Church's teachings about the soul, resurrection, and divine purpose would require unprecedented theological adaptation. Cultural evolution would slow dramatically or potentially stop entirely. Anthropologists have observed that human cultures typically evolve through generational change, with new ideas gradually replacing old ones as older generations pass away. Language evolution, artistic movements, fashion trends, and social norms all depend partly on demographic turnover. The Renaissance emerged partly because medieval thinking gave way to humanist philosophy as new generations embraced different values. Without aging, cultural conservatism might become permanently entrenched. Consider how musical tastes evolve generationally. Rock and roll shocked older generations in the 1950s, hip-hop faced similar resistance in the 80s, and electronic dance music continues to divide audiences by age. But if people never aged, the fans who embraced swing music in the 1940s might still dominate cultural preferences today. Innovation and artistic evolution could slow to a crawl without the natural pressure of demographic change. Technological development might accelerate in some areas while stagnating in others. Individual scientists and engineers could accumulate centuries of experience, potentially leading to breakthrough discoveries impossible within normal human lifespans. Einstein developed his theory of relativity in his 20s and continued productive work until his death at 76. If he had never aged, his contributions to physics might have been exponentially greater. However, scientific progress also depends on new minds approaching old problems without preconceived limitations. The Silicon Valley model of innovation relies heavily on young entrepreneurs who haven't learned that certain things are impossible. Mark Zuckerberg founded Facebook at age 19. Steve Jobs started Apple at 21, and Bill Gates began Microsoft at 20. Their youth allowed them to challenge established industries without being constrained by conventional wisdom. If experienced business leaders never aged out of their positions, opportunities for disruptive innovation might decrease significantly. Mental health implications would be unprecedented. Human psychology evolved around the assumption of mortality, with developmental stages that correspond to biological aging. Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development map psychological challenges to specific age ranges from identity formation in adolescence to generativity in middle age to integrity in elderhood. Without aging, individuals might become trapped in specific psychological stages indefinitely, unable to progress through natural developmental cycles. Depression and anxiety disorders, already affecting over 300 million people globally, could become permanent fixtures rather than conditions people work through over time. The hope that this too shall pass often helps people cope with difficult periods by understanding that time brings change. If time became endless but internal states remained frozen, psychological suffering could become unbearable. Suicide rates, currently claiming over 700,000 lives annually according to the World Health Organization, might increase dramatically. The promise of eventual natural death provides psychological comfort for many people enduring difficult circumstances. If that natural endpoint disappeared, some individuals might seek permanent escape from unbearable situations that would otherwise be temporary. Relationship dynamics would transform beyond recognition. Currently, romantic partnerships often deepen through shared experiences of aging, growing old together, and adapting to changing life circumstances. The phrase, "till death do us part," reflects the understanding that marriages naturally end through mortality, but immortal relationships would face psychological pressures never before experienced in human history. Dating applications like Tinder, which currently serve approximately 57 million users globally, would need to accommodate individuals with potentially centuries of relationship experience. The concept of age-appropriate partners would lose all meaning when someone could appear 25 while having lived for 300 years. Trust and intimacy, already challenging to develop, would become exponentially more complex when potential partners had accumulated centuries of past relationships. Urban planning would require complete reconceptualization. Current city designs assume population turnover through death, allowing for natural renewal and redevelopment cycles. New York City's urban renewal projects often wait for older generations to move or pass away before implementing major changes. Without this natural turnover, cities could become permanently frozen in their current configurations, unable to adapt to changing needs and technologies. Transportation infrastructure would face unprecedented strain. The New York subway system currently serves 5.5 million daily riders across 472 stations. If ridership never naturally declined through death, the system would require exponential expansion to accommodate permanently growing populations. Highway systems, already congested during peak hours, would face traffic levels that make current rush hour delays seem trivial. Water resources would become critical limiting factors. The average American uses approximately 80 gallons of water daily, while global freshwater reserves face increasing pressure from climate change and population growth. California's ongoing drought affects 39 million residents and threatens agricultural production worth $50 billion annually. Indefinite population growth would make water scarcity a permanent crisis rather than a cyclical challenge. Energy consumption would skyrocket beyond current renewable capacity projections. Global energy demand currently stands at approximately 580 exajoules annually, with renewable sources providing only 12%. The International Energy Agency projects that renewable capacity must triple by 2030 to meet climate goals based on current population trends. Immortal humans would require energy infrastructure expansion far beyond these already ambitious targets. Space exploration might become an urgent necessity rather than scientific curiosity. NASA's Artemis program aims to establish permanent lunar presence by 2028, partly as a stepping stone to Mars colonization. Current space exploration timelines assume gradual expansion over centuries as technology improves and populations slowly grow. But immortal humans facing exponential population growth might need to accelerate space colonization dramatically to relieve pressure on Earth's finite resources. The psychological implications of potentially infinite time would challenge fundamental human motivations. Currently, the scarcity of time drives much human achievement and creativity. Deadlines create urgency, aging creates wisdom, and mortality provides meaning to accomplishments. If time became unlimited, procrastination could become permanent, and the drive to achieve might diminish significantly. Why rush to write a novel, start a business, or travel the world when you have literally forever to do these things? Economic inequality would likely become more extreme over time. Currently, wealth accumulates across generations through inheritance, but natural death limits individual accumulation to single lifetimes. The Forbes list of billionaires includes individuals who built fortunes over decades, but even the wealthiest eventually die and pass assets to heirs. Immortal individuals could accumulate wealth across centuries, creating economic disparities that dwarf current inequality levels. Warren Buffett, currently worth over $100 billion, built his fortune through compound investment returns over 9 decades. If he never aged and continued investing for centuries, his wealth could eventually represent a significant portion of global GDP. The concentration of resources in immortal hands could create permanent economic castes that make current wealth inequality seem trivial. Innovation patterns would shift dramatically across all sectors. The pharmaceutical industry currently spends approximately $200 billion annually on research and development, with average drug development timelines of 10 to 15 years. Immortal researchers could pursue long-term projects impossible within normal human lifespans, potentially leading to breakthrough discoveries in areas like quantum computing, fusion energy, and space propulsion that require decades of sustained effort. However, institutional innovation might decline as established organizations become permanently entrenched. Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen observed that disruptive innovation often comes from new companies challenging established players. But if business leaders never aged out of their positions, corporate hierarchies could become permanently calcified, reducing competitive pressure that drives innovation. Agricultural systems would need revolutionary advancement to feed permanently growing populations. Current global food production utilizes approximately 1,500,000,000 hectares of arable land, representing roughly 11% of Earth's land surface. Vertical farming, currently a $4 billion industry, would need massive expansion to meet increasing demand. Laboratory-grown meat, still in early development stages, would become essential rather than optional technology. Climate adaptation strategies would become permanent lifestyle changes rather than temporary adjustments. Current climate models assume that warming effects will eventually stabilize as populations age and energy consumption patterns mature. But immortal humans would need indefinite adaptation to changing environmental conditions, potentially including permanent relocation from coastal areas threatened by sea level rise. The Maldives, consisting of 1,200 coral islands with an average elevation of 1.5 meters above sea level, faces complete submersion within decades. Currently, the nation's 400,000 residents could potentially relocate as older generations pass away naturally. But immortal populations would need permanent solutions for climate refugees, creating massive infrastructure demands for receiving nations. Social security and retirement systems would require complete elimination or transformation. The concept of retirement assumes that people will become too old to work effectively and deserve support after decades of contribution. But immortal humans might never reach a point where they cannot contribute economically. Current retirement ages, typically between 60 and 70, would become meaningless markers rather than life transitions. The psychological comfort of knowing that difficult periods will eventually end through natural processes would disappear. Currently, people endure challenging jobs, difficult relationships, or health problems with the understanding that time naturally brings change and eventually release. Immortal humans would need new coping mechanisms for potentially permanent difficult situations. Mental health treatment would need fundamental advances to address psychological conditions that could persist for centuries. Current therapeutic approaches often focus on helping people process and move past traumatic experiences within natural lifespan frameworks. But trauma that could persist for hundreds of years would require therapeutic innovations beyond current understanding. The concept of midlife crisis, typically occurring around age 40 to 60, reflects psychological adjustment to aging and mortality awareness. Immortal humans might experience similar existential challenges repeatedly across centuries, requiring new models for understanding and treating psychological development across indefinite lifespans. Educational credentials would lose much of their current meaning. A medical degree earned in 1950 would have very different relevance today compared to one earned recently. But immortal doctors could accumulate centuries of practical experience that far exceeds any formal educational achievement. Professional licensing and credentialing systems would need complete reconstruction to evaluate competence across indefinite career spans. The pace of social change would likely slow dramatically as established power structures become permanently entrenched. Historical progress often occurs as new generations challenge existing systems and replace aging leadership. The civil rights movement, women's suffrage, and LGBTQ+ rights all advance partly through generational change. Without natural leadership turnover, social progress might stagnate indefinitely. However, individual learning and growth could reach unprecedented levels. A historian who stops aging at 30 could potentially witness and document centuries of human development firsthand. Their accumulated knowledge and perspective would be invaluable for understanding long-term historical patterns and trends, impossible to observe within normal lifespans. Ultimately, the end of aging would represent the most fundamental transformation in human existence since the development of agriculture 10,000 years ago. Every institution, relationship, and assumption about human life would require reconstruction around the reality of indefinite lifespans. The species that evolved to live approximately 75 years would need to develop entirely new models for organizing society around potentially eternal existence. Whether humanity could successfully navigate such unprecedented change while maintaining the creativity, adaptability, and progress that have defined our species remains the ultimate question in this remarkable scenario.